Everybody, it's Michael from Replica Airguns. I've got a bunch of my revolvers on the table here. These are all shell loading revolvers, and I've had several viewers ask me about the different shells for these different guns. Which shells work in which guns? Can you use some shells from some guns in other guns? A lot of questions like that. It is kind of confusing. Some of the shells look very similar, but they can have some subtle differences. So I'm going to go over them now. And to start off, we'll kind of exclude certain guns first because their shells really aren't that compatible if you look at them. So let's talk about the Gletscher NGT pistols. Now I want to sort of exclude them from this list just because their shells are smaller in diameter. They're literally a smaller in diameter shell. So if you try to put any of these larger shells in the guns, they just don't fit. Okay, so that's a Webley shell. Here's basically a Dan Wesson shell. Doesn't fit. Okay, we have a pellet shell here from a Dan Wesson styled revolver. We also have single action army shell. Not going to fit. Okay, so that pretty much excludes the Gletscher shells from working in any other guns but the Gletschers. Now the second thing about the Gletscher guns is you'll notice we have a pellet one and we have a BB one. So the pellet one is thicker all the way through. The BB shell, it has a smaller, basically the end of it, or the back of the shell is smaller because you don't put the BB in the back, you put the BB in the front. With the pellet shell, you put the pellet in the back because you can't really load a pellet from the front. You know, sort of backwards, it would be kind of weird. You'd probably have a lot of difficulty doing that. So the shell goes in the back when you're using the pellet shell, and the shell goes in the front, or the BB goes in the front of the shell. Pellet goes in the back here, BB goes in the front, which in a sense gives more allowance for the pellet to, you know, it's got a longer barrel. If you look at it, you're adding about 1.5 inches of barrel length to the gun, which I think helps the performance. And when I did my shooting test, the pellet version did really well. It had good FPS compared to the BB. I think it was even faster, and it was shooting a heavier pellet, so not too bad at all. All right, so we'll kind of exclude those guys from the list here for now. Another pellet shell that I want to exclude is the Colt Single Action Army. They are definitely different. Now I'm going to compare it to a Dan Wesson shell. Even though this isn't a Dan Wesson, we have our Dan Wesson, basically we have our Dan Wesson shell like revolver here. We have a Dan Wesson shell kind of here, right? So you'll see that these shells, even though they're from different guns, are pretty much identical, other than one is for airsoft and one is for steel BB, as you can see the difference. But in terms of diameter, length, the materials being used, they're both almost identical. So we'll put the airsoft version back, even though this is for the GNG. What is this one? This is the GNG G731. Dan Wesson shells will work in the GNG 731. Okay, so comparing to the Single Action Army, they look very similar, but see if I can show you this. It's very subtle, but the lengths are slightly, just ever so slightly different. So the Dan Wesson shell is slightly longer. That does make a difference, even if it's just a little tiny bit. It does make a big difference. Plus, you'll notice the heads on them are slightly different too. So this one's a little smaller in diameter. This one's a little wider in diameter, and that's got to meet up at the front of the chamber area where there's basically a spring sort of fed seal, I guess, or gasket. It's not really a plastic one, it's more of a metal seal, but it sort of presses tight against the front here, so it has to be the right size. So you could try using these in the guns, but you're not going to get the same results. They may kind of work, but not really that well. Okay, so let's put this back here, put this back here. Now both of these shells are from the Colt Single Action Armies. They look very similar, but the silver one is actually the lead pellet one. Now, can you use either one in either gun? You might be able to get away with steel BBs in there, but you know, I'd rather just get the pellet shell and use the pellet one in there because there's probably some very, very small differences in the chambering size or the size of the actual, you know, how wide it is in there. Okay, it looks the same, but I would say don't put BBs in the pellet shell. Don't put pellets in the BB shell. You might get away with it, but you could have some of them getting stuck a little bit, that kind of thing, right? All right, so Colt Single Action Armies, really only work in the Colt Single Action Army pistols, and use the pellet shell for the pellet one and the BB one for the BB one. All right, let's get back to the Dan Wessons. We have the Dan Wesson 715 here. Same shell basically as any of the other Dan Wessons. Now this is a pellet shooting Dan Wesson, that's why I have this pellet shell here. But if it was a BB version, I could probably put a steel BB shell in here and shoot steel BBs out of the pellet version, but I could scratch up that rifled barrel a little bit, so that wouldn't be a good idea, but you could probably use it in that gun. Could I use pellets in the steel BB version? I wouldn't. Again, there might be some diameter problems. You might have pellets kind of getting stuck in there, because typically pellets are going to maybe be a little bit larger in diameter than a steel BB, and you might have some getting stuck in there. Kind of might work, but you don't have a rifled barrel in the steel BB version, so I wouldn't use it. This shell, you basically you don't even have to unscrew it. It's just pressure fit. So you put your pellet in here and you close it up and you use it in whatever Dan Wesson style revolvers are basically made to shoot the rifled pellets, right? Rifled barrel with pellets. Now with airsoft, you just have slightly different looking shells because they have a larger opening for the larger caliber, right, ammunition. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Smith & Wesson. Now these are basically KWC made guns. Umarex has a rebranded Smith & Wesson 357 version. This is the KWC 357 version. You'll notice it has the safety here. It's got the different type of grip. You put the CO2 right in the bottom. You don't pop this open, right? It's a little bit different. Are the shells the same though as the Dan Wesson? No, they're not. Okay, they're a little bit different. You can see they're quite a bit different in size. So meet it up at the bottom there. So they're different length, right? So the 357 shell is longer. So if you put it in, for instance, a Dan Wesson, it's probably not going to work so good. Right, it'll fit. It doesn't even fit. So it's actually a different diameter too. So you can see that, right? Not only is it longer, but it's a different diameter. So that's good. You know right away it's not going to work in there. It's not gonna, you're not gonna be able to use it. Could you put a Dan Wesson shell in the 357? Well, because it's a smaller diameter, you might get away with it, but you'll notice it just doesn't really, trying to make them fall out, it doesn't quite go far enough out, and so it's not going to necessarily seal up. You might kind of be able to use it, but you're not going to get the best results because it's just the wrong size. It's not long enough. And again, going back to the Webley Mark IV, it's a completely different shell, right? It's shorter than the Dan Wessons, okay? Especially shorter than the KWC 357s, right? And diameter-wise, you know, it might not even fit. It looks about the same as the Dan Wessons, but it, you know, even a little bit difference can make a difference. It's way too short though to be used in any of the other guns. So hopefully that helps you understand what shells you can use. Basically my recommendation is use the right shell for your gun, right? So if you have a Colt Single Action Army, make sure you use the right shells. The Colt Single Action Army, either pellet or steel BB, or airsoft if you have an airsoft version. If you're using a pellet Dan Wesson, then use the pellet Dan Wesson shells. If you're using an airsoft Dan Wesson, again, use airsoft or steel BB shells just for the Dan Wessons, or that does cross over to the G&G 731. So keep in mind, this has got the same shells as the older Dan Wesson and the newer Dan Wesson. You just got to make sure you use the right either airsoft or steel BB shell for it, depending on what it is. And I'm pretty sure G&G only does airsoft, so more than likely it's just going to be airsoft shells. But if you have an airsoft Dan Wesson, you can use those shells in the G&G 731. All right, that pretty much wraps up this video. Hopefully that helped you understand a little bit more which shells you can use, what the differences are in these shells for these shell loading revolver guns. And again, always use the right ammo, always use the right shells for your gun. All right, thanks for watching another Replica Airguns video. Don't forget to subscribe. Check me out on Facebook and Twitter. Username is Replica Airguns. Also, come on down to ReplicaAirguns.com where I have articles, post reviews, usually additional photos of the products that I'm demonstrating and reviewing. And we also have our Canada and US online replica airgun stores located at ReplicaAirguns.ca for Canada and ReplicaAirguns.us for the US store. So if you're from Canada, shop in the Canada store. If you're from the US, shop in the US store. You'll find products like air guns, BB guns, pellet guns, airsoft guns, blank guns, knives, and other accessories there. All right, thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.